My name is Ruman, and you are watching The Oversight. Today, we're breaking down a huge move out of Washington. President Donald Trump is calling for the federal gas tax to be suspended while fuel prices are painfully high. That means the 18.4 cents per gallon the federal government normally charges on gasoline and 24.4 cents on diesel could temporarily drop to zero if Congress goes along. If you've been Googling, how much is the federal gas tax? What is the federal gas tax per gallon? Or just gas tax? This video is for you. I'm going to explain exactly what the federal gas tax is, how big it really is, who benefits if it's paused, who could get hurt, and what this fight tells us about inflation, war, and U.S. infrastructure policy right now. One person, one take, no timestamps, just a deep, honest look at the positives, the negatives, and the long-term consequences. What did Trump actually propose? Let's start with the news itself. In a recent interview and follow-up comments to reporters, President Trump said he wants to temporarily suspend the federal gas tax for a period of time and then bring it back when gas prices decrease. This is happening while the war with Iran has dragged on for weeks, pushing oil prices higher and sending average U.S. gasoline prices above $4.50 per gallon nationwide. Key points from his position. He says this is about giving drivers immediate relief at the pump. He has not set a precise end date. He's used language like until it's appropriate or until prices come back down. Legally, he cannot do this alone. Congress has to pass a law to suspend or change the tax. The idea didn't come out of nowhere. Just before Trump's comments, his own energy secretary publicly floated the idea of pausing the federal gas tax as one of several tools to ease pressure on families facing high fuel costs. So this looks like a coordinated trial balloon from the administration, not an off-the-cuff remark. What is the federal gas tax exactly? Now, before we argue about whether suspending it is good or bad, we need to answer the question millions of people are literally typing into Google, what is the federal gas tax? At its core, the federal gas tax is an excise tax levied by the U.S. federal government on every gallon of motor fuel sold in the country. The current federal motor fuel tax rates are 18.4 cents per gallon on gasoline, 24.4 cents per gallon on diesel fuel. There are also small federal charges on aviation fuel and jet fuel, but for ordinary drivers, that 18.4 cents on gasoline and 24.4 cents on diesel is what matters. This tax has two big characteristics. One, it is per gallon, not based on the price. So whether gas is $3 or $6, you're still paying the same federal cents per gallon. Two, it feeds into the Highway Trust Fund, which pays for federal highway and transit spending, roads, bridges, and other surface transportation projects. And here's an important historical detail. The federal gas tax rate has not been increased since 1993. Inflation has eroded its real value dramatically by roughly half, according to policy analyses done on proposals to raise it. In other words, the government has been trying to maintain a 21st century road system with a 1990s era nominal tax. When people ask, how much is the federal gas tax per gallon right now, or how much is the federal gas tax, the short answer is 18.4 cents a gallon on gas, 24.4 cents on diesel, unchanged since the early 1990s. How big is it compared to state gas taxes? Another common confusion. People see a news story about gas taxes and think the federal government is responsible for the entire tax on their receipt. That's not how it works. In addition to the federal tax, every state has its own gas tax. Many states also add additional fees or sales taxes on fuel. Recent state-level data show some states like California, Illinois, Washington, and Pennsylvania tax gasoline over 55-70 cents per gallon at the state level alone. Even mid-pack states often charge 30-40 cents per gallon in state gas taxes. That's before you add the federal 18.4 cents. When you combine federal and state, the gas tax per gallon that drivers actually face often exceeds 50 or even 70 cents per gallon depending on where they live. A local news item from 2025, for example, noted one state's scheduled hike would bring its state gas tax into the mid-50 cents per gallon range before you even add the federal rate. So if Trump gets his way and the federal piece goes from 18.4 cents to zero temporarily, that is real money, but it's only one piece of a bigger tax puzzle. How much would you actually save? Let's translate these cents per gallon into real-world numbers. If the federal gas tax of 18.4 cents per gallon is suspended, a driver who uses 50 gallons a month would save about $9.20 per month. someone burning 100 gallons a month, a lot of commuting or small business driving, would save $18.40 per month. Heavy-duty diesel users would see a bit more relief because the diesel tax is 24.4 cents per gallon on an individual fill-up. If you put 15 gallons into your car, you'd save about $2.76 in federal tax. That's not nothing, especially for lower-income households. But compare it to the overall price. With average national prices above $4.50 per gallon, and some areas much higher, an 18-cent haircut is a relatively small percentage change. That's one of the criticisms even from experts who are open to the idea of relief, including officials who note that federal gas tax holidays often sound bigger than they feel in practice. Economists also warn that in tight energy markets, part of any tax cut can get absorbed by producers and distributors rather than fully passed through to consumers, depending on competition and timing. So your real savings could be less than the headline 18.4 cents in some local markets. The positive case: why support a federal gas tax holiday? Let's be fair and start with the positives of Trump's proposal. First, immediate relief. Whether it's $5 a month or $25 a month, any reduction in cost can matter to people who are living paycheck to paycheck, especially when fuel is a non-negotiable expense for work and family responsibilities. For drivers who rely on long commutes, or for small businesses that run fleets of vehicles, those cents add up. Second, political signaling. A temporary suspension is a visible way for the administration to show that it is doing something about high gas prices driven by an overseas war and volatile oil markets. It sends a signal that Washington is willing to take a small hit on revenue to cushion households while the Iran conflict and energy markets remain unstable. Whether you agree or not, that symbolic aspect can affect consumer psychology and expectations. Third, inflation optics. Even a modest reduction in fuel prices can nudge headline inflation measures slightly lower, especially if the holiday is accompanied by other efforts and if oil doesn't spike in the meantime. Lower reported inflation gives the Federal Reserve more room to avoid aggressive rate hikes and could help cool some of the political anger around Bidenflation or Trumpflation, depending on which side you blame. Fourth, targeting the pain point. Gasoline is a highly salient price because everyone sees it on big signs every day. A policy that directly hits that price is more visible and tangible than many other forms of aid. That's why politicians in both parties have flirted with gas tax holidays over the years, even if they disagree on the details. So the la que al positive style argument is straightforward. This is a quick, targeted relief tool that helps drivers when prices are high and war-driven, and we can always turn the tax back on when markets calm down. The negative case: what could go wrong? Now for the other side. And there is a long list of criticisms coming from economists, transportation experts, some Republicans, and many Democrats. First, the Highway Trust Fund. The federal gas tax is the main funding source for highways and some transit projects. Suspending it, even for a few months, could strip billions of dollars of revenue from the fund, depending on how long the holiday lasts. That threatens already strained infrastructure budgets at a time when many bridges, roads, and transit systems are aging or in need of upgrades. Second, the relief is relatively small compared to the shock. As we saw, 18.4 cents per gallon is not a game changer when prices have risen $1.50 or more per gallon since a war broke out. Critics argue that you're risking long-term infrastructure funding for short-term savings that many drivers might not even notice in the noise of day-to-day price swings. Third, it can distort incentives. Higher fuel prices do encourage some reduction in consumption, more efficient vehicle choices, and in the longer term shifts toward alternatives like public transit or EVs. Suspending the tax sends the opposite signal. Cheap gas is back, even if that's not sustainable given climate goals and geopolitical vulnerabilities. Climate and energy transition advocates argue that if you want to help people with cost of living, there are better ways than artificially cheapening fossil fuel consumption. Fourth, it may not be fully passed through. In tight markets or areas with less competition, there is a risk that refiners, wholesalers, or retailers pocket some of the tax savings, especially if consumers are focused on the headline price and not following tax changes closely. That means the federal government loses revenue, but consumers don't see the full theoretical benefit. Fifth, temporary measures have a habit of becoming political footballs. If the tax is turned off, it can be politically costly to turn it back on, especially in an election cycle. What is pitched as a short-term emergency measure can evolve into a longer-term erosion of a key user pay principle for transportation funding. So the asked negative case is, you damage infrastructure funding, don't give that much relief, risk undermining climate and energy goals, and still might not fully help the people you say you're targeting. Who really benefits? Let's be honest, not everyone benefits equally from a gas tax holiday. High-mileage drivers benefit much more than people who rarely drive. Suburban and rural commuters, delivery drivers, and trucking firms see larger absolute savings than urban residents who rely more on public transit. https://www.youtube.com/watch. Higher income households tend to drive more miles and own more vehicles, so they can capture more total tax savings in dollars, even if the rate is the same for everyone. From a distributional standpoint, that means a gas tax holiday is a blunt instrument. Yes, lower income workers who drive will get something, but so will wealthier drivers with big SUVs or multiple cars. It's not means tested, and it's not targeted at the households most crushed by inflation. On the business side, long-haul trucking and logistics see real benefits from any break in diesel taxes. That can help hold down shipping costs and, indirectly, prices of transported goods. But again, whether those savings are passed on in the supply chain is uncertain and depends on competition and contracts. Meanwhile, people who don't drive or who use transit get almost no direct benefit while still bearing the long-term cost of underfunded infrastructure. That's one reason many transportation analysts prefer targeted subsidies or tax credits over broad gas tax holidays. How does this fit into the war and inflation story? This proposal cannot be separated from context: the war in Iran, rising oil prices, and broader inflation anxiety. The conflict has disrupted production and shipping, adding risk premiums to every barrel and pushing global benchmarks higher. At the same time, the U.S. economy is still grappling with post-pandemic inflation, rising housing costs, and Fed rate hikes that many blame for slowing growth and stressing borrowers. Trump's move is politically savvy in that context. It allows him to say, Iran and global markets are causing prices to spike, but I'm cutting taxes to shield you. It shifts blame outward and offers a visible domestic response. For voters, especially those who remember gas tax holiday debates under previous administrations, this feels familiar. Economically, however, it doesn't change the fundamental drivers of high prices: international oil supply and demand, geopolitical risk, and refining capacity. It's more like putting a thin layer of foam over a hard chair. Slightly more comfortable, but the chair is still hard. Because the gas tax is a fixed cents per gallon amount, its relative importance shrinks when oil spikes. If gas is $2, 18 cents is almost 10%. If gas is $5, it's a little over 3.5%. That's why some economists argue that policymakers should focus more on the root causes: war, supply disruptions, long-term energy strategy, rather than tinkering with a small, fixed tax. Long-term structural issues: roads, bridges, and the gas tax. The federal gas tax is not just a lever to punish or reward drivers. It is the backbone of U.S. surface transportation funding, and that funding was already under strain before Trump floated this holiday. Because the rate has been frozen since 1993, inflation and improved fuel efficiency have eroded revenues. Cars go farther on each gallon, EVs pay no gas tax at all, and construction costs have climbed. Analyses of proposals to raise the tax by 25 cents, for example, have pointed out that the current levy has lost roughly 45% of its real value since the early 1990s. Many bipartisan commissions and think tanks have argued that the gas tax either needs to be raised or replaced with a more modern system, like a vehicle miles traveled fee, if the U.S. wants to maintain safe roads and bridges. Against that backdrop, suspending the tax entirely, even temporarily, looks like a move in the opposite direction of long-term sustainability. So here's the tension: short-term populist relief versus long-term infrastructure finance. If we reduce gas tax revenue now, do we later raise the tax above 18.4 cents to catch up? Do we cut infrastructure projects? Or do we shift the burden to general revenue and thereby weaken the user pays principle that has guided U.S. transportation for decades? Those are the deeper policy questions that don't fit on a campaign bumper sticker. Alternatives: what could be done instead? If the goal is to help people with high fuel costs, there are alternatives to suspending the federal gas tax. Targeted rebates or tax credits, direct payments or refundable credits to lower and middle income households, independent of how much gas they use. Transit subsidies, lower transit fares, or free fare programs to give people viable alternatives to driving, especially in cities. Windfall profit taxes or temporary levies on excessive refining margins, with revenue recycled back to consumers in a transparent way. Structured gas tax rebates in rural areas where driving is unavoidable and alternatives are limited. Each of these has its own pros and cons, but they share one feature. They don't directly undermine the Highway Trust Fund in the same way a holiday does. They also can be more narrowly aimed at the households who are genuinely struggling, rather than giving the same per-gallon subsidy to everyone regardless of income. Political strategy and likely outcome. Will Trump's proposal become law? That depends on Congress. A gas tax holiday requires legislation, and that means negotiations between the White House and lawmakers who represent very different constituencies and ideologies. Some Republicans will like the tax cut optics but worry about deficits and infrastructure. Some Democrats will like the idea of relief but distrust a regressive fossil fuel-linked subsidy. Others in both parties will see an opportunity to trade a holiday for other policy concessions, maybe additional infrastructure funding from general revenues or new climate provisions or deficit reduction offsets. Historically, gas tax holidays have been debated more often than they've been enacted. When they are enacted, they tend to be short and controversial. So the most realistic path might be a compromise on a short-term gas tax holiday paired with backfilling of the Highway Trust Fund with general funds, and a renewed debate about long-term reform of fuel taxation. Politically, Trump gets the "I fought for lower gas prices" talking point either way. If Congress blocks it, he can blame them. If they pass a modified version, he gets to claim victory and leave the messy details to budget committees. Let's quickly answer the exact questions people are typing into search bars. How much is the federal gas tax? It is 18.4 cents per gallon on gasoline and 24.4 cents per gallon on diesel fuel. What is the federal gas tax per gallon? Same answer, a per gallon excise tax, not a percentage at those rates. What is the federal gas tax for? It primarily funds the Highway Trust Fund, which pays for federal highway and transit projects. How much is the federal gas tax per gallon right now in 2026? Still 18.4 cents on gas, 24.4 cents on diesel, unchanged since 1993, pending any new legislation. What is gas tax in general? It is a broad term for both federal and state taxes on motor fuel. State rates vary widely, often between about 20 and 70 plus cents per gallon on top of the federal tax. Trump's proposal is about suspending the federal part, not the state part. So what's my judgment here as your host on the Oversight? From a short-term political and emotional perspective, a gas tax holiday is seductive. People are angry, they're paying more to get to work, and 18.4 cents per gallon feels like a lever we can pull right away. Trump is tapping into that frustration and pairing it with a narrative about war, elites, and doing something. But from a long-term structural perspective, it's a distraction at best and damaging at worst. It threatens a key infrastructure funding source, offers modest savings relative to the scale of the price shock, and does almost nothing to address why fuel is expensive in the first place: geopolitical conflict, global supply dynamics, and decades of underinvestment in alternatives. If Congress insists on some kind of relief, I think it should be strictly temporary and clearly time-limited, paired with full backfill of the Highway Trust Fund from other revenues, combined with a serious public conversation about modernizing how we fund transportation in an age of EVs and climate change. If they are not willing to do that, then suspending the federal gas tax is like taking painkillers for a broken leg without ever fixing the bone. You've just heard a deep dive into Trump's proposal to suspend the federal gas tax. What it is, how much it is, who wins, who loses, and what it means for your wallet and your roads. My name is Ruman, and you are watching The Oversight. If you found this breakdown helpful, hit like, subscribe for more long-form analysis on the stories behind the headlines, and let me know in the comments. Would you support a federal gas tax holiday? Or do you think it's a political gimmick that makes the long-term problems worse? Stay informed, stay critical, and I'll see you in the next one.